All right, so far what we've been working on is we have been given a bunch of rules for lines, and we've used those rules to find different points or to graph the line. Okay, so what we're kind of working towards now is going the other way, where instead of giving you a rule, I'm going to give you the points, and I want you to tell me what the rule is. Okay, so to be able to do that, you're going to need to be able to find that pattern number. Right? We looked at our rule, we took the pattern number, and we used that to figure out how to find points when you're given another point, right? So that's going to be the first thing we're going to look at. And remember that pattern number is called your slope. So we're calculating the slope based on what information we're given. So there's three different kinds of information you'll be given, either a graph or a table or ordered pairs, and you're going to need to be able to find the slope. So that's what we're going to look at today. So let's start with a graph. The first thing that you need to do with a graph is you have to be able to find some nice points. Okay, so let's talk about what I mean by nice points. This guy right here, that's a nice point. Okay, and the way that I know it's a nice point is because this line crosses right through where those crosshairs are on this graph. So see how the coordinate plane has kind of like little dashy lines? And then my dark line goes right through those little dashy lines. Okay, they all cross in the same spot, so that's a good point. This right here, that's not a good point because the crosshairs kind of meet up here and the line doesn't go right through there. So that's not a great spot. Okay, this one right here, that's not a good spot either because see how it just misses? It doesn't quite go exactly through. So that's not a good spot, right? This guy right here, that's not a good spot either. See how it just barely misses? You got to look really closely. Okay, that's not a good spot. But down here, that's a good spot. Okay, all three of them cross in the same spot, right? Our coordinate plane lines cross and the line of the actual equation cross all in the same spot. So that's a nice point. Okay, and then I'm going to keep looking, right? That's not a good point. That just barely misses. That's not a good point. Nope. Nope. But that one's a good one, right? It crosses right through those crosshairs. Okay, so that's the first thing. And that's something that some people find really, really easy, and then other people find really difficult to do. Okay, so if you like are looking at this and you're like, yeah, obviously, that's awesome. Okay, but some people kind of struggle with this. Okay, so the first thing that you have to do is you have to find some nice points. All right, once you have those nice points, all that we're going to do is we are going to count rise over run. Okay, so I'm going to write that here. We go rise over run is what it's called. All right, so rise is how much up and down, run is how much sideways. Okay, so what I'm looking for here is I'm going to start at any one of these points. It doesn't matter which one. I'm going to start at this bottom one. And I'm going to count to go from this point to that point. How far up do I have to go? And then how far over do I have to go? Okay, so that's what I'm going to count here is how far up and then how far over. So let's see, from this point to get up to this point, I'm going to go straight up following these grid lines. So I have to go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces. So that right there, I went up 5 spaces. So that is the rise for this problem. That's going to be my top number. All right, and then I'm going to count how far over did I have to go. So I went all the way up to here, and then from there I have to go over 1, 2, 3 spots. So that one I went over 3. That's my run, and that's my bottom number. So my slope is 5 over 3, or we use m for slope. Remember we talked about that? So m is my slope, and it's 5 over 3. I went up 5 and over 3. Okay, now one of the things that some people get confused on with this is that when we plot points, right? When you plot points, you run and then jump, right? When you do slope, it's the jumping that's on top and the running that's on the bottom. And that throws people off because sometimes people will put them upside down because they think, oh, run and then jump, right? But the running goes on the bottom here and the jumping goes on the top. So you got to really remember it's rise over run. So rise over run, how far up and then how far over. Okay, so let's look at this guy right here. So we've got these points that they already found for us, and you can see that they went up 3 and over 2. Okay, and the nice thing about slope is that it doesn't matter which points you use. If I were to look at this guy and count again, from this point to this point, it went up 3 and it went over 2. So it's the same numbers no matter which way you go. So the slope for this one would be rise of 3 over run of 2. Okay? And if we looked back at this example, if we had used different points, I wanted to use the two bottom points, but if we hadn't, if we'd gone from, say, this point to that point, it's going to work out the same. If I count, I'd go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's my rise of 5. And then my run is 1, 2, 3. So my run is 3. You get the same thing either way. Okay? And that makes sense because that's how our patterns have always worked, right? Our patterns have always been the same between points. You could have even gone from this point to this point. And what would have happened if you'd gone from this one to this one? Well, your rise would have been 10 and your run would have been 6. So you get 10 over 6, but 10 over 6 simplifies to 5 over 3. Okay, so that's how you find slope when you're given a graph. Now, there are a couple of things that you should be aware of because there are some special lines, and that's where Mr. Slope Guy comes into play. Okay, so Mr. Slope Guy, he's kind of funny looking, right? But this is a tool that you can use to remember some different things about your slope. Okay, so the first thing is that you're going to see there's a plus sign, and then it's kind of eyebrow here slanting up. So when you have a line like these ones we just looked at that slant up like that, your slope's going to be positive, right? We went up 3 and over 2. If you have a line that slants down like this one, though, then your slope's going to be negative, okay? And you would say, since you went down some, right? So like if my line looked like, say, this, and we had 2 points, right? And we measured, and we said, okay, to get from one to the other, I have to go down 2. We'd write that as negative 2. And then say we were going over 1, then we'd write that slope as negative 2 over 1, right? So negative 2 over 1 would be my slope, and then we would just simplify that. So for this example, it would be negative 2 over 1, which you could also simplify to just negative 2. Okay, so negative slopes tilt down, right? So positive tilt up, negative tilt down. Make sure that you remember that. That's a good check-in for you right at the end. If you figure out your slope and you look at your line and it tilts down and you have a positive slope, you know you did something wrong, okay? So that's a really good spot to check in. All right, but then there are 2 other special ones. If you have a line that goes straight up and down, okay, so straight up and down, see how his nose kind of looks like a U? Okay, that is for undefined. Okay, if your slope goes straight up and down, your slope is undefined. All right, if your line goes sideways, so it's completely flat, see how these look like zeros? Okay, well, a sideways line has a slope of 0. Okay, and you'll kind of see that as we start doing some of these, but you'll see that kind of show up. An undefined slope happens because your rise, you've got a rise, but your run for this one would be 0. So you'd end up with 0 on the bottom, and we can't divide by 0, so that's a problem. But this guy, you'd go over, right, as much as you wanted to, but up 0. So your rise on top would be 0, and that's okay. That would just simplify to 0. Okay, so use Mr. Slope Guy to help you out with those special ones. All right, so that's how you find the slope from a graph. Second thing we're going to do is we're going to find the slope from a table. And this is using something called change of x over change in y. Okay, so this right here, this looks really fancy. And this is for slope again. All right, and this little triangle right here, that just means change. Okay, so all this is saying is it's the change in the y's divided by the changes in the x's. Okay, so this is pretty easy. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to take a look at your table. All right, and in your table, we're going to start on the y side, so over here, and we're going to find our change in y. So I'm going to look and say, okay, from here to here, what happened to my numbers? Well, from negative 2 to positive 1, that's getting bigger, right? These numbers are all getting bigger. So that means I'm adding, and I added 1. To go from negative 1 to 0, what happened? Well, you add 1 to go from negative 1 to 0. To go from 0 to 1, you add 1. To go from 1 to 2, you add 1. These numbers should all be the same. Okay, so that is my change in y. I'm adding 1 every time. So on the top, I'm going to put a positive 1. Okay, then I want to find my change in x. So change in x, I'm going to look on this side of the table. And we're going to do the same thing. From negative 4 to negative 2, what happened to those numbers? Well, these numbers are all getting bigger. and it got bigger by 2. So I'm going to write plus 2. From -2 to 0, what happened? Well, I added 2. From 0 to 2, you add 2. From 2 to 4, you add 2. So my change in x, which again, these should all be the same, is that I'm adding 2 every time. So on the bottom, it's 2. So my slope for this table is just 1/2. Okay, so that's pretty easy. You just have to, again, kind of remember it's a little backwards. You might be tempted to do this one over that one, but it's not. It's always change in y's over change in x's. All right, so that's how we find it from a table. And then the last thing you might be given is you might be given ordered pairs like this. So they might just give you 2 points. Well, here's what we're going to do. Instead of learning a whole new method, we're just going to use a table. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do, right? Watch this fancy trick. I've got these 2 points. I'm going to go like this. Bam, now it's a table, right? Here's my x's and here's my y's. So I can do the exact same thing that we just did with our other table. So I'm going to look at these and I'm going to figure out, well, what's my change in y? How are these numbers changing? So make sure you're really careful about whether you're going up or down. So I always kind of like look at it and say, okay, from -3 to -6, is that getting bigger or smaller? That's getting smaller, so I'm subtracting. And then those are 3 apart, so I'm subtracting 3 on that side. Okay, and then on this side, from 2 to 5, is that getting bigger or smaller? It's getting bigger, so I'm adding 3. Okay, so then for my slope, my m, because remember m stands for slope, my slope is a fraction, and it's change in y, which was -3, over change in x, which was +3. Okay, and then all we're going to do is simplify that fraction. Okay, so 3 divides evenly into both of those. So this simplifies to -1/1, right? And then we can just write that as -1. So this just has a slope of -1. Okay, so think to yourself for a second. This guy, we had a slope of +1/2, right? What kind of line is that going to look like? Is that line going to tilt up or tilt down? Is it going to be straight across or straight up and down? So my slope was +1/2. This guy, positive slope, my line would tilt up. All right, this guy over here, we got a slope of -1. So look at Mr. Slope guy. If it's a slope of -1, what's my line going to look like? Does it tilt up? Does it tilt down? Is it straight up and down, or is it sideways? Slope is -1. This guy, negative slope, so my line should tilt down. Okay, so that's what I would expect my line to look like for either one of these 2 bits of information. All right, and that is how you find slope. So there's really 2 ways of doing it. You either use your graph and just count your rise over your run. Make sure you find nice points. Or you use a table and you find change in y over change in x. Okay, if you have ordered pairs, you make it into a table and find change in y over change in x. Okay, and that is how you calculate slope.